Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Enhanced Pod. I have got a guest returning today, and he is going to be helping me explore this theme of school sports and all things school sports, from performance to rehab to where is the future going. I think it's very appropriately timed as we are in the early to mid part of March 2026, and we are approaching winter sports across the country, which means one thing: there is a lot of schoolboy rugby about to enter our timelines, our social pages, our streaming platforms, Supersport Channel 216, and the whole lot. So joining me is a physio that is also, like myself, working in the school sports space down in the Eastern Cape. A very warm welcome to our returning guest, an expert thought leader, the kind of founder, and I want to say community engager with the Sports Med Web group, doing incredible things and getting clinicians to engage in topics. I wanted to pick his brain because he is doing a very similar themed talk around the country at the moment, around training, maturation, what happens to the adolescent body, and how we can optimize the way that we get them to perform and rehabilitate them as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, returning Eurico Marques. Welcome back.
Nick, thanks. I take it as I did okay the first time, the fact that I got an invitation to come back. So it's always a good sign. Thanks for having me. I love this stuff, so I could talk about it all day, but hopefully we can get some value to the people listening.
Awesome. So, for just a brief overview of yourself, for people that don't know, you've got a background in professional sports. You are a physio. Just give us the in a nutshell version.
So in a nutshell, got a history in professional sport. Predominantly been involved in adolescent sports since I graduated, really. And sort of have a passion for working with adolescents, not only in injuries, obviously injury, that's my field, but athletic development as well. And really trying to create models or philosophies that match their stages of development, whether that be rehab or athletic development. And that's sort of my main area of interest at the moment. And that comes down to the first podcast, which was about the coaching and working with them. So yeah, it's sort of where I spend my time reading, and yeah, love this sort of stuff. So let's get cracking there.
And Yurko, I want to dive in right there and say, I think even as physios, I've been in the space also now going on a decade. And I think sometimes we treat adolescents, especially let's just think about young boys and rugby guys. We almost treat them like mini adults, but they're actually going through a lot of physiological changes and developmental changes throughout their high school journey. Give us some of the key points for other clinicians to understand, for maybe parents or coaches to understand as well, around their journey, their development, and what is happening physiologically in their bodies from 13 all the way to 18.
I think it's important to remember that from about 9 till 18, it's the wildest time to be a human. Like you change shapes, your emotions change, you get hormones you never knew existed, or they didn't exist in your body until then. So there's this massive change that happens. Now it also then happens within the context of an adult world, right? Um, and that adds a massive amount of stress onto the system in terms of what they have to take in, how they develop. And I think it's important to remember the ranges that happens. And that's sort of my main message on most of my talks is these changes happen at such varying rates. And we'll talk about some of the ideas around this, but that's the main takeaway for the parents and the coaches is that when you're looking at somebody, they're not 11, they're not 12, they're not 15. It might be that according to how long they've been on earth for, but the emotional, psychological, physical development is on such a massive scale. And if we just treat them all the same, even though even as adults, even as the same, we're just missing so much. And there's the consequences can be pretty dire, which we'll talk about. And I think we spoke offline first is this is not a podcast to bash the system and do this. Like there's people doing such great work in this space. There are people in sports departments, coaches, they work hard and they love the kids and they really want things to work. I think it's just a matter of just trying to reflect for everyone involved at the moment. Let's just reflect, have a look back and think what's in front of us. I mean, what do the kids sort of need? And I think that's an important junction where we're at the moment.
100%. I think you touched on the issue of of biological age and chronological age. Maybe just go in a little bit deeper there for you, Eurico, for parents that might not understand what this concept is.
So I think that for me, there's three things. I'll even break it down further. I think there's three things. I think there's the relative age effect people have to be aware of. And that's saying that if you're born close to an age cutoff, that you receive some sort of advantage. Now, that advantage is not only sporting, it's also academic. You see it in scholarships, you see it in the leaders at schools, like they get some sort of advantage. What that advantage is, or where it's coming from, I'm not 100% clear. But that's one of the things that starts to happen, right? And they start to develop slightly more confidence. So you see that that's one thing that's related more to chronological age, at when you were born based on the cutoff. The other one is then growth. Now, growth is continuous. It's the most prevalent and most rapid during the first 2 decades of life, but it can continue afterwards. For example, you can grow your stomach in December and then you can ungrow it in January, and you can grow your muscles if you train. But growth is the most sort of prevalent and sort of the most accelerated during those adolescent years. And then there's maturity. Now, maturity is the timing and tempo to reach a mature adult state. That obviously has a fixed point. It does end, and the scale that happens, or the timing and the tempo which that happens, is so variable. So really your biological age is effectively where are you on that scale with growth, maturation, and relative age. And I think one of the important things just to distinguish is that although those three things are associated, they're not necessarily 100% correlated. They can be sort of going on their own. So you can have someone born in the beginning of the year, January, and he can be a late developer. Doesn't mean if you're born earlier. So just trying to keep that in mind, that these three things are moving at the same time, but not necessarily moving together. Keeping that in mind.
Yuriko, can you explain this effect that you see? And there's like memes that go around when you're looking at like maybe under 13 Craven Week or under 12 Craven Week, and you've got this big prop and you've maybe got this tiny little winger, and they look like they both under 13 or under 15 or whatever it might be, but you've got these huge you spoke a bit about the variation for parents, especially around rugby. What are some of the pros and cons and just observations that we have when that happens at the sort of early teen stage?
So, I mean, one of the big things I try to emphasize is that in a chronological age grouping, everybody is kind of losing. Maybe the kids on time and on the on time maturers aren't losing, but the early and lates they're losing out, because the early developers, right, they're just using brute force. They're normally bigger, stronger. So they're using and the late developers are smaller. Right, so they're kind of just getting run over. In football as well, in rugby, anything where there's contact. And when you look at the numbers, that's where it gets scary, and that's where you start to think, "Oh, is this even safe?" For example, if you go under 14s, they can be twice as heavy weight-wise in the same in two age bands, which we often see, right, under 15, under 16. But if you go rugby, some of them are 3 times heavier. If you look at performance metrics, they'll jump early maturers, sorry, will jump 5 times higher. They'll run 10 times further in endurance tests on a yo-yo test. I mean, that's just staggering numbers. Right? And then you look at under 15, and they can be like, I mean, there's a study done on 15 rugby players, kids weighing 46 kilos to 127. That's the range. Right? And you look at, and you just think to yourself, you know, they're going to run into each other at some point. So it really starts to think, okay, well, how are we going to sort of get this right? And one of the things to remember is maturity can offer a 40% advantage, and growth can give you about a 10% advantage. So if you grow earlier and you mature earlier, you can have a 50% advantage over your peers. Now, obviously, as you get older, that sort of that does become equal. But now you got to think, who even survived to get that far, um, on both ends of the sphere. And you see it in the data. I mean, look at Craven Week under 13, only about 24% of the kids make it to senior Craven Week. So even the early developers are struggling to adapt in the system. So it's just trying to think about what do we do in that situation? How do we adapt? How do we create a more equitable system that supports everyone that's within it?
Yuriko, I think you've started this conversation really well by sort of framing some of the maturation, developmental changes and ranges that we see at this age group. If we can't always affect rule changes and maybe highlight some rule changes that are currently in place, How do we combat that by maybe focusing on age appropriate training or sort of developing long term athletic development models in this school sort of space?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the interesting one is that ultimately our kids still have to play age group sports, and I completely understand. It's so difficult on a big scale to do these things, right? So these maturation things. A, you have to have everybody on board, and B, you have to have systems in place that can measure it accurately. So age grouping is just on a big scale, just easier. But I think when there are rule changes. You see no contact rugby before the age of under 9. You can't play under 16s if there's under 19s playing in first teams. So intuitively, people start to do these things. And I think coaches are actually quite good using the eye to see early and late developers. You can see it. It's very obvious. You see those pictures all the time. So my big thing I always try to say to people is like, a match is only 1 hour of the week, but there's potentially 3 contact times before that during the week. So there's still opportunity there to create a system that supports player development and keeps them safe. For example, in training, you could do it at a inter-house level. You could do it. I mean, I'm currently coaching, well, involved in the under 14C rugby team. And just as an idea, for example, I line them up by height category. I divide them shortest close, and they can play touch rugby like that at least in the beginning of the session. At least those late developers are getting opportunity to play against peers with the same physical qualities. And the early developers are also now being matched like for like. They can't now match against a smaller kid. So even in those small moments, you can still make massive differences to those kids' developments. And if you take a late developer, he's unlikely to play a lot on Saturday. Don't get me wrong. I'm not here saying that he should be playing, and I understand that there's challenges to this. Um, but now for 3 days of the week, he actually gets age matched or maturity matched training and exposure. So he develops the skills, and as he grows up, those skills will go with him. But I think that the biggest thing for me is he's got to stay in the system. So if we don't create some sort of maturity matched system, he's going to drop out. He's going to get run over 3 or 4 times. He's going to think this isn't fun. Um, I'd rather go play something else. And he's potentially going to get hurt. In our world, we see them get hurt. So I think that's just one of the things to consider is even at the most, I call them micro solutions. Even on a one-on-one solution with you and a coach, you can make such a massive difference. You don't need, I think one of the challenges with us as humans is we want the system to change, but we don't realize there's micro, there's meso, there's macro systems. You can just change your micro system and make a massive difference in a child's life. And I think that's one of the things I try to emphasize with the talks and with the coaches that I work with.
Eurico, I think the physical development and if I give you a segue, you've seen there's a lot of incredible facilities and resources at schools for training and specialist S&Cs, sports scientists. GPS is becoming a lot more commonplace, and all these sorts of tools and tech. Um, what are the considerations that we might have overlooked in the past, or maybe what do you think is important in terms of dealing with the high school athlete? What sort of age appropriate trainings should we be looking at through the journey of high school, and maybe in the context of early late developers?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to sort of motor competencies, right? You got to have a basic set of skills. I think what we've overlooked generally is we're just training them based on what we need at that moment. So when they get to 15, irrespective of not if they have the skills, we give them resistance training. And then they don't learn to move properly. So you get sort of reach a ceiling. They can't lift more. So they can't get stronger. So they kind of get stuck as well on that plateau. On the other side of it, but the early developers, we don't give them enough. I'm sorry, the late developers, we don't give them enough. They're small. We're worried about it. I know one of the myths is that the lifting weights is going to constrain your development and your growth. It's going to stunt your growth. I mean, we know that's not true. Now we have the evidence to support that. So I think that's the sort of thing. It's not being maturity matched in the gym as well. So looking at the individual, and I'm not against the idea of creating motor skill groups and saying, listen, I know you're 15, you don't have the foundation skills. Let's give you those skills. By the time you're 16, you'll be able to be better in the gym. Conversely, on a younger child, listen, you're 14, you're early developer, right? You got the skills. We can see you move nicely. Okay, we're going to test you a little bit more, right, within that. And I think one of the big things is resistance training doesn't have to be weights. because I appreciate in a big class setting, it's quite difficult to control 30 kids around doing deadlifts and power cleans and snatches. Um, but there can still be, and when you say age appropriate, I think that's where it comes in. Can you do the basic things: vertical, push, pull, jump, sprint, hop, skip, bilateral low limb, unilateral low limb? Those things aren't exercises; they're competencies. So get competent when testosterone helps you out, right? If you're a male, right? Or if you're a female, that's the opposite, which I think is important to talk about the females as well. I know we talk a lot about rugby. Um, but in the girls, it's a little bit of the opposite, right? Because their development, they're sort of going through puberty actually makes it harder for them to participate. With boys, it's an advantage. You get testosterone, you grow, you get muscles, you get bigger. Girls, they get more fat mass, especially around the hips. They get heavier, right? It becomes harder to move. It can potentially even be sore to move. But so bearing that in mind is that even boys and girls is not the same solution. And so you've got boys and girls not the same solution. Age is not the same solution. You need to be creative within your constraints, within your context. And I think there are creative solutions out there. I don't think we have to be, it's also, we don't have to be overwhelmed by it. There are solutions, dialogue, conversation, get other people's ideas. So yeah, I think that sort of answers your question. Because it's very hard to give specific answers to those things.
No, I think you've highlighted some more interesting points there. Um, a lot of the work might take place in the gym, but it's not all about uh, deadlifting and back squatting and bench pressing, for example. Like you nicely mapped it out. There's movement competencies that need to be considered. Um, I think I think a challenge that we have is that we systems are overloaded as well, so we tend to paint everybody with the same brush. But it does take a lot of dialogue. It does take a lot of zooming out and looking at context and probably collaboration between professionals, and hopefully conversations like this help. And I think you've highlighted an incredible point about the girls as well. There's a lot of subtleties and nuance that we need to consider when working with just the adolescent athletes in general. Eurico, talk to me a little bit about age appropriate sort of skill development. So let's look at something like your ability. There's like this plyometric window where you are most kind of available to adapt to plyometric type of work or speed work once you've obviously got these core motor competencies. And then you've got windows where you might be more responsive to resistance training, etc. For the S and Cs that are listening and maybe want to tweak the way that they are kind of managing their school athletes, take us through a little bit of how that should look at different phases.
So I think obviously from my perspective, I look at injury risk, right, and how that affects performance. And I think one of the things to consider, and for parents as well, and for students as well, for listening, is that before you get your peak height velocity, which is your greatest change in height, but that's most of those kids are quite competent because they sort of in proportion. Most of they jump well, they hop well, and everything's sort of in proportion. As they get a little bit older, they move to that peak height velocity. For boys, it's about 13. Girls a little bit before, right? 11-ish, 12. Obviously, there's variance there. But boys normally 2 years or so behind girls in general. But when they get to that phase, they actually become quite awkward. Um, and that affects their ability to hop, to jump. And you see them, they were jumping before and now they're no longer able to jump as well. So I think trying to just keep that in mind when you sort of programming or working with your kids or giving your kids feedback, for example, that my biggest thing is like the kids aren't lazy. They're just changing. So when you're sort of considering what's appropriate areas, and there are guidelines out there, there's so many things. Now, the thing is always like those guidelines are great, the frameworks are great, but the applicability at the individual level needs to be more considered, especially to that peak height velocity. Like growth related injuries are more common during peak height velocity, boys and girls, right? And after peak height velocity, it's normally soft tissue injuries. So obviously, if you're considering plyometrics, hopping, jumping, it's a lot more explosive after you've hit peak height velocity, just considering that the skeleton has grown, the muscles grow afterwards. So there is this increased strain on those growth sites. So bearing that in mind, how much you program, plyometrics, and again, within the same group, you can have, I mean, kids can be up to 5 to 6 years different in terms of development or maturity in the same age group. So I mean, to give an example, we have a boy, he's 11, maturity wise. Right? and he's under 15. And his boys at his age group, they 16, 17 years old, maturity wise. So do those two boys get the same thing? In my opinion, no, it shouldn't be. So, yeah, one needs more motor control, more needs more basics, needs more things. Still needs the hopping, still needs the plyometrics, but needs the basics first. He's 11, 12 years old. But the other older boys, they develop more. Have they skipped the motor skill development? Some have, some haven't. I mean, there's came out last year, 2025, that 50% of kids don't meet their physical literacy uh, requirements in adolescence. So, like, it's a crazy number. You flick a coin, half can, half can't. So, again, for me, it's always going back to the basics. Go back to the basics. You'd rather spend the extra 6 months teaching them how to move properly. Once they have that, then they can then keep going. You can't load inefficiencies. Eventually, you get stuck.
Great point. Um, on that, maybe just quickly for the parent that's listening and doesn't understand peak height velocity, just unpack that in layman's terms for us.
So peak out velocity is the period of growth where where it's the greatest. So it's generally about, like I said, 14 for boys. They're sort of growing at about 7 centimeters or so, 7 to 8 centimeters, 10 depending. But then there's a sudden increase, and normally sort of related. It's not necessarily always related to maturity. It can some in boys generally it's a little bit before. We're talking about skeletal maturity, so they'll generally get longer, and then they will then put the muscle on. So that's that period of where I always say be careful. That's when the physio bills come, right? During that awkward phase. And then for girls, it's a little bit different. That's 2 years before. So it's a sudden change in growth, in length, that you sort of see in them. Does that make sense?
Brilliant answer, Eurico. You mentioned some of the physio bulls that happen in that phase. Let's talk a little bit about the common injuries and the injury patterns that we find in this adolescent group.
So in adolescence, you look at them, I always say, the heels in grade 8, the knees in grade 9, and the hips in grade 10. And that's what you sort of see. And that's the growth plates, they close in ascending order. Right? So heels first, severs, and then you get the knees, they get the that front anterior knee pain, the kids get that little bump, Osgood's, and then you get those sort of avulsion injuries or apophysitis injuries, which is traction on the growth side. Um, and that's the sort of common pattern you see during peak height velocity. Um, as they get past peak height velocity, you start to see those hip flexor strains, right? But again, it's really based on the mechanism of injury around that point. But you see a lot of that, the biggest concern around that is a lot of those growth-related injuries, are they self-limiting? You know, it's the debate's always out there. Like, should we be more aggressive with managing them? There's a recent paper to show that, Osgood-Schlatter, the prevalence of Osgood-Schlatter is related to lumbar stress injuries. So is the Osgood's a warning sign? And should we actually be more careful with those kids? Again, it's so difficult because your context determines that, right? The context, the patient, the parents, the stresses that you get. Does he need to play? It's your biggest game of the year. He's struggling, but he wants to play. So, should kids play in pain? I mean, these topics are endless. But I think it's important just to remember that these patterns they do exist, right? And you can sort of predict them. You can be more careful during peak height velocity. So for parents and students and coaches to be more careful when their kids start to grow more, to be more aware, and then, maybe you need to just take it easy, and just trying to. My biggest thing is educating the kids about it. This is what's happening. You are changing. These things they don't go away automatically. So a lot of my work predominantly is around awareness in this space. This is what happens. These are the patterns, but consider yourself to be in the norm, not the exception. Uh, if you happen to be the exception, that's great. But I mean, if you look at early and late developers, it's about 16% on either side, and 68% of the kids are on time. So most of the time, you're going to be okay, right? And those kids will kind of manage, but the early and late ones, but the early developers, they tend to get more of these growth-related injuries because they're really accelerating, right, in their development. But the late developers generally less, right, because their skeletal development's a little bit slower, but their muscular development's a little bit slower, so they tend to trend more on a linear path up towards it, right? But then really just being aware, like, okay, this boy has grown. Like, he's grown a lot recently. If you're not tracking it, which most of us don't, it's hard to track 400 students. If you're not tracking it regularly, listen, you've grown. I'm just going to keep an eye out on you. Notify the coaches, listen, Nick's grown quite a lot. Just let me know how it's going. I'm just trying to open those communication channels with their parents as well. I'm just trying to manage the system, but not be too uh, sort of reactive around it.
Some really, really good insights there. And I think some tips as well for systems and programs and sort of leads in those spaces. But as a as a clinician, or even as a parent, maybe, where my kid starts to have these growth related injuries, what are the things that I can do besides sort of managing their participation or exposure? What sort of preventative strategies are kind of supported in the literature?
So I mean, I have to say every responsible podcast has to say, see a health professional. I think one of the things that's important is never not to self-diagnose. At Google is a dangerous space, especially when you're working with pediatric injuries. So, so I think it's trying not to self-diagnose. Rather, like these things are pretty prevalent. They're pretty easy to diagnose, right? And most clinicians, at least working in a school space, would know of these things, and they'd be pretty straightforward to diagnose and manage. When you start to ignore them, it's one of my big things is not to ignore it. I think sometimes as parents, I'm a young parent, but you kind of like shrug it off. "Ah, it's okay, it's okay." And there's a point when he's not okay. I think that's important to acknowledge. And that's, again, there's no right answer to that. It's up to the parents and the thing. But see a health professional and then open some sort of dialogue with your child, because ultimately we use the word self-limiting. And really what that means is a lot of that is learned fear and fear avoidance, right? Understand the relationship with pain. So trying to open a dialogue, get to understand what your kid thinks. I mean, for generally load management is the gold standard. Um, Rehab, it depends what you do because it could just add more load, which again could aggravate even further. So sometimes exercises aren't necessarily the best case. Stretching, again, right, you're just adding more tension across the growth site. And we know that the skeletal system has grown first. So you're stretching effectively a already taut system. So is that going to create more change? That going to create more irritability? But I'm of the opinion that I don't stretch kids with growth uh, related injuries, right? I prefer load management. But if they if they're not working, generally what we then do is we control their load sport. So we might swap one of their sessions out for a rehab session, just to create a bit more strength there, potentially some lengthening through some training. Um, but again, we generally don't just add more rehab because it's just more load. I think one of the challenges during these phases is we want to do more and more and more, but potentially we don't need to do more. We just need to do what's appropriate, which doesn't mean, or that also doesn't mean one of the things you often hear is, they don't have to be out completely, especially with growth related injuries like the severs, the knee, the hip. If it's a traction, if it's like a apophysitis, which is just an irritation at the growth point, they don't have to be out completely. Trying to keep them involved, trying to find ways of doing it. We're very lucky, but we're quite open with the coaches and they're quite open to trying to keep the kids involved as much as possible. But again, that comes down to dialogue and relationship building and all things that aren't necessarily clinical, right?
And I think that's the challenge for clinicians sometimes is working in these sort of spaces is building the rapport, having the knowledge and being able to communicate that or sell that to a coach or a parent. And most importantly to the young athletes that need to understand what am I going through, what are the risks, the pros and the cons, and what is our sort of overall strategy to manage this. And then are my parents on board, are my coaches on board, can they support me through this period? So I think really valuable conversations to think about.
Yeah, my system development for this stuff is I have like three like little acronym, connect, catch, and include. And you can do that with one person, you can do it with 100. And it's like, connect with the kid, try to understand what they're going through, right? Connect with the child. What are you feeling, from a clinician side, right? Catch means, create a safety net behind them, right? But you don't have to be all over them during these phases. Like, just be behind them. Create the safety net is you. It's involving the parent. It's involving the coach. It's involving potentially in our environment, adults, their tutor, a housemaster, someone else in the space. At least now the four of us, we can catch this kid. Whether it be injury related, because there's a lot of pressure on the kids. Like us, said to you offline as well. When we were young, we used to play. We used to make memories. But now these kids, they make highlight reels. Right? And we used to play, and the one week you were amazing, and the next week you forgot about it because you couldn't remember you had to play the next game. Now you're only as good as the next Super Sports School's school magazine show thinks you are. And it's like these kids are they internet superstars, some of them at all ages, because you can watch under 14D rugby, right, in Super Sports School. So again, it's a lot of opportunity there. I just think we just have to think about it. I know there's a lot of risk about safeguarding, and it's good to see those concerns be coming up, right? And as a clinician, I just consider my role and how do I create a system around this kid in the environment which they exist, and then include is that's the modification. Can we include him somehow? Can he train at least? Maybe he can't play this week, but can we keep him training? Can we keep him involved? And as he settles down, then we will then start to open up the floodgates.
I love that acronym, Eurico, and thanks for sharing that with everybody. Connect, catch, include. I think for parents, clinicians, people that are around boys and girls playing sport, I think it's so good to understand these. You've touched on a point, just going back to super sports schools, and it's a double-edged sword. Obviously, it's great because it's a bigger platform. It allows granny and grandpa that are not in the same city to be able to stay up to date with, the rugby on the weekend or the cricket or whatever it may be. But I think it also comes with, as you kind of allude to, with a lot of social pressures on kids, which is a different kind of, it's a different stress or physiological, maybe even psychological stress as well. It's a different kind of stress that kids face now. And we're saying we've got the context of their injury, we've got the context of sometimes the pressure to be included and to participate, but that is definitely changing the landscape. What's your sort of takeaway or experience in this, and from the viewpoint of helping kids through their injury journey as well?
It's the $1 million question, right? Because I mean, we're in such uncharted territory at the moment, which I think is exciting. Like, don't worry, I'm not a naysayer. I'm not someone who's saying I don't think it's going anywhere. I think me and you have agreed that it's not going anywhere. But now it requires some creative thinking, find solutions that protect the kids, provide them with that exciting platform as well, provide granny and grandma outside of the world as well with that opportunity. I have heard of some solutions which I'm not 100% sure on how they're going to pan out. We're going to have to be reflective and see how it goes. To, Again, to me, it always comes down to connection, right? I mean, like, for example, these kids, they're picking out little videos every now and then. That creates a lot of anxiety. And we know the effect of anxiety on injury, on pain. We know their perception goes up. We know it's difficult now to discern that does he not want to play because he's scared of being embarrassed because last week he was embarrassed and that video is still circulating all over the internet, which does happen. So he kind of wants to withdraw himself. So he comes to you with a minor injury, but now it's massive. How do you sort of tell the difference with that? And then on the converse, how do you protect the kid who wants to play on TV effectively, right? But he's injured, and it isn't even safe for him to be out there. But this is his big game. This is his big year. This is his matric year, and he has to play in this big game. And everyone's going to see it all over the world. So again, it's a tricky space because we've never been here before, right? We know how to do it with adults because we've done it before, but with the kids, it's different. And again, I always involve their parents. I think the parents have to decide, right? The challenge with this is there's no right or wrong answer. Every answer is right in the right context, and every answer is wrong in the wrong context. So everyone sort of needs to work out, okay, what is our tolerance for this? And it's interesting because it's very clinical, right? You look at that smart return to play framework and look at that bottom square, and it's got all those things you never consider. The problem is we haven't to consider that now with the kids as well. So again, connect with their parents, connect with those things. Keep people, to me, it's all about conversation. Keep people talking all the time. Once you have silence, it becomes so hard to navigate this. When you create silos, so hard, the more voices, the more opinions. Be open to objection, right? Like, be open to someone saying, I don't think that's a good idea, or I think he should or shouldn't play. Be open to that idea. But doesn't mean that has to happen. Just continuous dialogue, considering the kid. Because the thing is also dialogue with the kid, right? I often ask them, do you want to play? Because don't consider your injury. Do you want to play? Because we know the psychological readiness affects all that. So all these things which are now sort of coming together, and that's what's changed in school sport, right? Is adult challenges have filtered themselves down into the childhood space. And are they equipped? Are they emotionally ready? Who knows? Yeah, who knows?
I think you raised or touched on a topic there where we need to make decisions with the kids because the decisions are about the kids. So
Yeah,
getting that input is important, obviously in conjunction with parents, guardians, um, etc. A couple of points from just working in this sort of system, or comments maybe. I think if we keep the young athlete at the center of this conversation, and then that sort of drives our willingness to dialogue, discuss, um, for us to maybe read further as clinicians and upskill ourselves around this changing landscape. What is the literature saying? What are kids going through their whole sort of developmental period, and understand really good, and sort of deep, contextual, um, you want to know the whole picture, from the clinical parts to the psychological parts to the, what does this mean that it's now all being streamed as well. um if we can get that right, by with still keeping the kid at the center, and be willing to have these uncomfortable conversations sometimes, I think that's how we're going to adapt to this uncharted sort of territory that we're in.
yeah, 100%. I mean, so to give you an idea of like how the acronym came about, like, I mean, the connection to me is massive. But the catching is because we know that, I mean, 80% of kids in the US drop out of sport by the time they're 15. In America, it's about, in Australia, it's about 50%. In South Africa, I think it's a little bit better because we make it compulsory, right, for them to play, right? But there's still kids disappear out the sides, right? So what happens to them? And then we know the association between the chronic health risks, right? And we know the impact of your health when you're an adolescent and how that impacts your health when you're an adult. And that's what sort of got me going down this. Then, that's where the include came from. Well, you have to keep them involved, um, even if it's just in the discussions, because we know the long term implications of this. You're going to get unhealthy adults, they're going to have unhealthy kids, and that's not going to undo itself over time. The school sport landscape in South Africa is like nothing else on earth. Like most people who come and say this is not like, and I think America potentially has something similar, right? But we have a unique thing, and the reality is the current system, in my opinion, it's effective. But with the Springbok champions, it's effective, but it's not efficient because we have 30% of up to 30% of adolescent females are obese or overweight, mostly in high income societies or economic status, right? That's not a good number. That's 1 in 3, right? Boys, it's about 10%, still too high for me. So there's a lot of inefficiencies in our system. That doesn't mean the system's not effective. It is effective. We win at a high level. But what are we as clinicians worried about health and safety? How are we making sure that these things are being known and aware of? And how do we keep people aware of them? How do we keep the kid who comes to see you and the 14D who starts a little bit over it? How do we keep him involved? How do we make sure that he's active? He's reaching his 1 hour a day physical activity. And I think that's where our role as clinicians is going to come in this conversation. We don't have to worry about the money and the sponsorships and image rights, which you hear. But that's not my role. That's not my lane. My lane is to make sure that the kid who sits on my bed continues to stay active, play sport because he loves it. And how do I make people in my space? How do I influence that within my space? Is my sort of thinking at the moment.
I want to kind of surmise and bring it all together, Yurko, and maybe sneak one more question in. But I think what we're getting at is that sometimes you almost end up putting kids into two baskets, and there's like this high performance stream that we kind of tend to throw all the attention and focus on, and those guys play last on a Saturday, and it's the crowds and the festivals and all the big things. But I think sometimes we think those are also separate from the kids that are. It's super important that they are participating for all the physiological, health benefits, from the social parts of playing sport, the life skills. In actual fact, they are one and the same, really.
Yeah.
And I think the sometimes what I often find myself doing is the decision making that we have for the under 14C rugby player is no different to the framework that we go through with the first team captain in the boys' school sort of setting. And I think maybe that's something that I know, yes, they're different pressures, but I think from our role as clinicians, I don't actually see much changing other than just subtle contextual things. Your thoughts?
100% agree with you. I think people say that first team level, that's high performance. In my mind, I had that challenge about 2 years ago, and some guy said if you wake up in the morning and you want to be a better version of yourself today, that's high performance. And I think then when I see an under 14D player, he wakes up, he wants to play under 14D, that's high performance. Right? So I got to give him similar opportunities in terms of care, right? But also in terms of participation, making sure that there's a light shining on him, right? And then on the other end of the sphere, the high performer on the first team level, making sure he's protected, making sure he's heard, making sure that he's not placed under, when he is placed under undue pressure, I'm making people aware of that. Right? That, this kid's told me potentially that there's a lot of pressure on his. Can we think about that? But so I think it's one and the same. Right? It's just I think that's actually where, as clinicians, that's going to be the magic of how we involve in this. I don't think we should exclude ourselves from these conversations. We are very much equipped to help people navigate this space, and that's going to be a massive, massive part of us moving forward as professions. And I think, me and you are aligned in this. Like we're talking everybody in the clinical doctors, physios, buyers, SNCs. Like we are one as a collective, in my opinion, having to put a little bit of this perspective on this and say, guys, listen, we're here for you. We're going to help with 14D. It's all the same thing. Like let's consider it in that context.
I love that analogy, and I think that's probably my biggest take home that we could give to clinicians. And I think in the same way that the streaming and this commercialization sort of part has given opportunities to kids to play on bigger platforms, similarly for clinicians. And if you're field side and all of a sudden there's 10,000 people at the St. John's Festival, it's a big occasion. And if you just doing community level sport before, then you might not be in those sort of situations. I'm fortunate enough to be in a lot of different settings. And I'll tell you, when there's 10,000 people on a sports field for a schools match, it's not far off. It's just not a big enclosed stadium, right? You don't get that experience very, very often. But
Yeah.
if you zoom away from that and just think of the under 14 seed kid that wants to improve is a high performer in the same way that the first team captain is. Um, our role to kind of support, to educate, to give opportunities, to set up systems. I think that's our sort of duty to this adolescent sort of group. So, Eurico, thank you for your thoughts. Thanks for your insight and your wisdom and sharing. I want to say, parting question, one thing that you think needs to change from now till forever, or one improvement that we can take away in this space, what would you say?
If I could change one thing, I would. It would be great if schools or clubs could initiate futures programs, which are programs that create intention around late developers. And on the other side of that, early developers would benefit as well. But it's an intentional way of including. I think that's the best way to navigate this space because all the other pressures aren't going away overnight. So we can at least be intentional in our space. And the futures programs, if you want to see Belgian football, but it's also coming out a little bit in the US. There's Swedish ice hockey, Norway, um, their general Olympic program. I think that's the way I would like to see us go. But I'm patient as well.
I think it's a long game that we're playing, so time
Yeah.
will tell. Eurico, thank you for your time today. And I want to
Right.
say, if you enjoyed this conversation, Eurico, this is his second time being with us. So I'll link his previous episode as well. He always leaves lots of crumbs and threads that we can go pull on and look up. So scroll through this episode, make sure you are following the podcast. All the episodes I've put getting pushed onto Spotify as well as YouTube. So make sure you give us a follow, engage, leave a comment. And I think that helps spread this. So if you find that any of the content discussed in this episode is helpful, please share it with a friend, a parent, a colleague. anybody that's in our school sport community. Like we said, we're not bashing anybody. We're trying to be examples of starting these conversations, which we feel adds incredible value to the boys and girls in the system, but also to the greater sort of school sports community in South Africa.